Hello and welcome along. Now, I've just finished reading The Buried Dagger, which is the Horus Heresy book, which broadly covers the story of Mortarion. And it covers in quite a lot of detail his time on Barbarous, growing up, and his eventual fall to chaos. And so I thought now would be an ideal time to do a video on the early life of Mortarion and why he became the terrible Primarch that he was. And maybe also give a little bit more insight into how it's a little bit more understandable that he does end up like he does. And perhaps I have been a bit harsh on him in the past when I have judged him as probably one of the worst Primarchs. So, of course, Mortarion lands on the planet Barbarous, which is a death world, and a world that is essentially shrouded in toxic fog. So it's extremely hard to live on this world. It's very barren. There's almost no life, and what life there is extremely difficult to share a planet with. So there is a human population, but they are forced into the sort of the lowlands where the fog doesn't tend to go as much. They can't venture up into the hills because that's where the fog starts and it will kill them very quickly. And within this fog zone live the overlords, who are something not quite human. It's hard to tell exactly what they are. They are either aliens or severely mutated humans. It's not made clear at all in the book and in anywhere else, really, whether they are supposed to be aliens or mutants. I think on the balance of evidence that they're probably alien, but it can't really be certain of that. They are certainly corrupted by chaos, and they are big users of warp power, which they generally use to raise the dead, essentially. They like to gather bodies and turn them into their puppets. They like to also mutilate the living and kind of combine them together into sort of flesh puppets, sort of golems, which they call them, which they use in their armies. They do a lot of things that the Dark Elder, or Drukhari, as you're supposed to call them now, do. They are like craft in flesh. They're sculpt in flesh. They do it almost as for their own amusement as much as to create soldiers. They constantly fight each other, so they don't really see the humans as an enemy as such. The humans are like cattle to them. They're just useful sources for their golems to create. They just want them for their bodies, essentially, to use them to build more flesh golems that they can use to fight each other. They aren't really worried about the humans as an enemy or some kind of threat to them in any way. And they know that the humans can't come out of the valleys because of the toxic fog anyway. And the humans on Barbarous live in such a basic way. They're subsistence farmers who have next to no technology. There is a sort of leader figure amongst the overlords, the High Overlord, who is more powerful than the others. But he doesn't rule the others as such. He just kind of dominates them more than each other. So they still attack him. He attacks them. There's constant war between all the overlords. He just happens to be considered the most powerful. And he also occupies the highest point on the planet, which allows him to have his fortress/palace in the most isolated, hardest to get to point should you try and attack him, which gives him an advantage over some of the overlords. But again, it doesn't really make a difference in their internal warfare because the overlords seem to be essentially immune to the poison, and the humans are no threat to him anyway. So, I mean, he could live in the lowland. There would still be no realistic threat from the humans. But in time, it will actually serve a purpose because the humans will rise up under Mortarion's leadership. And in that case, it does become the hardest place to conquer for Mortarion's armies because it's the highest and therefore the most toxic. Now, into this environment comes Mortarion. So he lands in his pod. He is found in the sort of remnants of a battle by the High Overlord. So it's more luck, really, than anything else that the High Overlord, the most powerful Overlord, finds Mortarion. It could have been any one of the other ones, but it's him that finds him. What he decides is he sees his baby who's somehow surviving in this toxic environment that should be impossible. So he thinks, well, this is an incredibly tough baby. And the one thing he admires is endurance, the ability to just get through incredible hardship, to overcome suffering. So although he sees this baby that looks like a human baby, he doesn't see it as just another human. He sees it as an opportunity to create a son, essentially, a successor to him. So he is trying to turn Mortarion into his successor throughout the life of Mortarion. But being an evil alien/mutant, he does it in his own unique way, which is to essentially torture Mortarion throughout his entire life. So he puts him into situations which should almost kill him, but not quite, all the time. So he's constantly pushing him to do things that are essentially impossible, but you might just get through. And if he doesn't make it through, he will help him out at the last moment just so he doesn't die. And then he'll punish him for not being good enough to pass the test. But if he does make it through the test, well, he just says, well, you've made a small step in the right direction, but there'll be harder tests to come. And there's always a harder test to come. There's always something harder for Mortarion to do. So he never is satisfied with Mortarion's progress. And Mortarion grows up to feel an enormous amount of resentment towards this father figure of his. He's always pushing him to be better, but not in a supportive way. He's always basically saying, you're a failure. You're constantly a disappointment to me throughout Mortarion's life. And of course, that affects Mortarion hugely. He is, as I said, deeply resentful of the Overlord, but he also has this feeling of inadequacy all the time. He always feels like he needs to push himself to prove himself to be worthy. And that really carries on all the way through his life and is the driving factor behind his fall to chaos, is fallout with the Emperor and so on, because he never feels worthy. He does, however, reach a point where he's had enough of the High Overlord. And this comes in a moment where he sees these humans trying to escape from the Overlord's troops quite near to where he lives, so on the boundary of the fog zone, where Mortarion can survive, but the humans can't survive there very long. They've escaped from transports. They're all going to start dying off as the fog kills them off. Something sort of triggers in him. He's going to flip, and he decides, I'm going to help these people. He does have some sense of morality, some sense of empathy within him for these humans, and he wants to help them. And he's also kind of broken free of the control that the Overlord had over him, which was, of course, the control that every parent has over children, which comes from the indoctrination of being brought up by someone. When your parent is there from day one, there's an element of control that they have over you simply because they were there. And you believe everything they've said up to that point because you had no other choice. And he's reached this point in his life now. Let's say he's kind of reached his rebellious teenage stage. So he's decided he can't just carry on like this, working for the Overlord, being constantly tortured and pushed and demeaned and treated like shit, basically. So he sees this moment where he could intervene and help these humans fight the Overlord's troops, and that's what he does. So he does that, he helps them escape, and so once he's helped them, he's killed some of the Overlord's troops, he's now in a situation where there's no turning back. So he decides, well, I'm not going to go back to the Overlord and face this punishment for me turning on him. I'm going to go with these people. And so he goes with the humans back to their village. Now, in the process of doing this, he actually meets someone who will be incredibly influential on his life, and that is Calas Typhon. So Typhon is one of the humans, or at least sort of, which we'll come to in a second, and he is particularly rebellious amongst the humans, so more likely to fight back. Many of the humans don't even try and fight back because they're so used to being dominated by the Overlords, but Typhon is quite rebellious in his nature, and he kind of reminds Mortarion of himself, and he's very resilient, very tough, and even though he's a weedy little human, he is desperately fighting back against the Overlord's troops, so Mortarion sort of bonds with him quite quickly. That leads to this friendship where they are more close to each other than they are to anyone else, and that will probably remain the case throughout their lives until the time of the heresy. So Typhon does have a much greater influence over Mortarion than anyone else does. The curious thing about Typhon is that he actually is almost, in some ways, everything that Mortarion will come to hate. So he is a psyker. He is corrupted by the powers of chaos very early on. And in many ways, he is Mortarion's Erebus. So Erebus leads these Lorgar down the path to chaos because he's already deeply corrupted, and he manages to manipulate his Primarch down that path. Well, Typhon does the same to Mortarion. He's not quite as manipulative as Erebus is, and so Erebus spreads chaos much more successfully amongst the Imperium, amongst the other Primarchs and so on. But Typhon certainly is there from the early days, a corrupted psyker, someone who is enthralled to chaos, although he doesn't truly know it as so much as Erebus seems to know. He is still a psyker, which Mortarion hates because he hates the Overlords, and the Overlords are psychers, so much of their power comes from their psychic ability or their sorcerous practices. And the fact that his closest friend is actually a psyker is extremely ironic when you think about the deep hatred that he has for psychers and anything to do with psychers, to the point where he hates Magnus simply for existing as a psyker, hates the Thousand Sons, and of course speaks against them all the time, won't serve with them. He is deeply suspicious of anyone who is a psyker or potentially has dabblings with sorcery, and that comes from his hatred of the overlords. He sees them using this ability to do terrible things all the time and to oppress him as well as anyone around him. So it's kind of relatively justified hatred of sorcery, because all he's ever seen is this example of it being used in a bad way to cause suffering. But his closest friend is a psyker, and he knows he is a psyker. It's not like he's completely ignorant to this. He knows he has some ability to do things. In this very first battle where they meet each other, he is using his psychic ability to influence these sort of weird ground worms, creature things that can grab people and bite them. So he uses those to fight, directing them to attack these flesh golems who are trying to recapture them or kill them. And he notices this, and so he isn't ignorant of the fact that his friend has these powers. He just kind of overlooks it throughout his life. The other thing about Typhon is he is half overlord. He's a hybrid. He's not truly fully human. Now, this is extremely interesting if you think about it. Partly a normal human and partly a mutant human. And there are other people that have had some sort of slightly mixed backgrounds in that sense within the Imperium. I mean, the Imperium at this stage, a very early Imperium, is open to abhumans, for example, serving in quite large numbers within the Imperium, within the Imperial Army. So the fact that someone has a mutant strain, shall we say, within them wouldn't be absolutely prohibit them from serving in the Imperium. But it's odd that they actually made it into a legion, because I'm not sure if I'm aware of any other Astartes who have a mutant background, other than, of course, all of the Blood Angels, because they were specifically recruited from mutants all the time. That was their early years of the Blood Angels. That's what they did. That's one of the things that's so impressive about Sanguinius's gene seed, is that it can take mutants and turn them into angelic Astartes. But generally speaking, mutants do not make it into the legions, because you have to have excellent genes even to be selected to be given gene seed in any other legion. And that's just to be selected, of course. Once you go into the process, any slight flaw in your genes is going to lead probably to your death during the process of implantation. So for someone who is literally half normal human and half something else to make it through implantation is unusual in many ways. Unusual that he was even allowed to become an Astarte, but also unusual that he actually made it through the process of implantation. Now, it could even be more extreme than this. He could actually be half alien, but as we said, what exactly the overlords are is not clear, and it's perfectly possible that they are aliens. They certainly sound alien in their description. They don't really sound that much like mutants, because they're all relatively similar. They're not weirdly mutated or different in that way from each other. They seem to have a relative cohesive appearance and behavior, etc., live in one community, etc. They seem to just be aliens who happen to be stranded on this planet Barbarous with these humans, and they use the humans as their toys, as their cattle, and they don't behave as if they're mutated humans. But I can't rule that out, because it's not ruled out in any of the sources I found. So if the overlords really are aliens, Xenos, that means Typhon, who will become Typhus, is half Xeno. Now, can you imagine that is a half alien hybrid being allowed to enter the legions and then become their first captain? I mean, that's incredible. Now, obviously, I can't ever imagine that being allowed by the Imperium if they knew about it. So it's possible that Mortarion just didn't care because he's his best friend. And he thought, well, I've got this legion. Obviously, he's going to be joining it, because he was one of his closest servants, probably his closest advisor, his closest friend, certainly. So it made perfect sense of just what was going to happen. As soon as he became commander of the legion, all of his closest officers of his death guard, which he had created to fight back against the overlords, were going to join the legion. That was just the way it was. And no one really thought about, well, maybe one of them isn't half alien. No one probably really thought about that at all. Now, I think that would probably make Calas Typhon the most unique Astarte out of all. The fact that if he is a half Xeno. Now, there's also something else which is unusual about him, which is not unique but unusual, is that he was an adult. He was a full adult when he was turned into an Astarte, which again is not the normal process. Now, this did happen reasonably large amount during that early days when Primarchs first took over their legions. They tended to want to take their closest advisors, military officers, into the legion with them. And so older people then would, after that point, become Astartes, did become Astartes. So Typhon will eventually become Typhus, a champion of chaos and of Nurgle particularly, and he will lead Mortarion down that road throughout his life. He wants Mortarion to embrace the ruinous powers, but he takes a very long time to get to that point, and probably without the events of the Horus Heresy, he might not have ever been able to achieve that. So Mortarion, after he's left the High Overlord, he's formed this friendship with Typhon, and he's sort of taken on the leadership role amongst the humans. He starts to fight back against the Overlords, mainly because that's really all he can think of to do. It's like, well, what else is he going to do? So he slowly builds up a kind of hit and run campaign, guerrilla warfare, where he strikes back at the Overlords, hitting convoys and scouting parties, that kind of thing. Builds up his forces. He develops his skills more and more as a general, as a leader, and he eventually manages, after many tough battles and huge losses, he does build up his power to the point where all the humans on Barbarous are united in following him. And he's defeated many of the smaller Overlords. It's partly because the Overlords have such contempt for the humans that they constantly underestimate them, and they never really fight back in full force or unite to fight the humans. So they're easily picked off one by one as they fight each other, and then just get surprised by these humans who suddenly seem to be well organized and motivated. And eventually it leads to the point where a High Overlord is the only one left. This sets up his kind of a situation which will lead to him having unending resentment towards the Emperor for the rest of his life, because he's ready to win this final battle to become the ruler of his people, of his world, of Barbarous, to free them from the Overlord and to get his final revenge on the Overlord. And most importantly to him, he's at the point where he can prove to the Overlord that he is actually worthy, that he is good enough, that he's so worthy, so good that he actually can beat the Overlord at his own game. He's conquered everything the Overlord never could. But the last thing he has to do is defeat the Overlord himself. Because the High Overlord is on this peak, this mountain peak, essentially, where his fortress is, and he's so high up, the toxins in the air are so strong, even Mortarion struggles to get to that point. So he can't take any of his troops up there. He tries to assault the palace, the fortress, but his troops have to turn back because they start dying off, as they just can't cope with that level of toxic air. And it sort of degrades their armor, it breaks things down, it starts eating through their breathing tubes and things like that. It's just not possible. But in the sort of jaws of defeat, victory of a sort is given to him, because the Emperor turns up. Now, the Emperor turns up and sort of does his usual mysterious thing where he kind of pretends to be someone else, doesn't really reveal who he is, says he can help Mortarion, and gives him some idea about the Imperium. And there's these worlds up there beyond the clouds, because in Barbarous you can't even see the stars, it's just clouds. So the people are quite enthusiastic for this. They can think, well, this is a final end to all the suffering, all of the pain, the lack of resources, all of these things. And everyone's starting to kind of be a little bit too friendly and a little bit too hopeful for this stranger who's come down and promising these things. And Mortarion, instead of thinking, brilliant, I can finally defeat the Overlord with this guy's help, he's thinking, I can't believe this guy's taking my thunder, he's stealing my thunder. I was just about to win the final victory and prove my worthiness, and this guy turns up and everyone's all only interested in him. I'm the one that they should be thanking for winning this war. That's all seems to be yesterday's news, because this new guy turns up. He's pretty adamant that he doesn't need any help. He doesn't need any help. Go away. Don't need you. I'm not interested in what's going on out there. All I care about is finally defeating the Overlord and freeing Barbarous by myself, because I did it and I don't need you. That's essentially what he's thinking. And so the Emperor is like, well, I will make a bargain with you, essentially. If you can defeat this guy on your own, then I'll go away. But if you can't, then, and I need to help you, then you have to swear your loyalty to me. Of course, the Emperor knows that Mortarion can't defeat the Overlord, so he's not really risking anything. He's just waiting for the inevitable failure of Mortarion, and then he'll step in and claim Mortarion and the world of Barbarous for the Imperium. But from Mortarion's perspective, he's kind of stuck in a situation where he can't back down now, because he's like, well, okay, I said you should go away. I can do it by myself. If I refuse this bargain, I'm accepting I can't do it by myself. So he's stuck. So he has to say yes. So he agrees to it. And of course, he probably thinks, actually, no, I can beat the Overlord. Even though he has failed once, he thinks I can, just by sheer determination, because that's what really drives Mortarion. This idea that if you just endure, you can always succeed. You just have to keep going. And no matter how bad things get, no matter how much suffering you have to take, you will win if you deserve it. If you just keep going and you just keep pushing harder. And that's what he's drilled into all of his troops, into his death guard, as he calls them, that only through enduring suffering do you deserve victory. So he's already a bit disappointed in them, the fact that they couldn't make it up this mountain because it was just too hard for them. So that's already a little bit of bitterness there towards them. And now they've sort of embraced this new guy that's turned up and is promising all these things. That's made him feel even more bitter towards them, because it's like, well, what happened to the adoration you had for me when I was leading you? We had one defeat, and now you're turning to this new guy. So he's really stuck in this situation. We have to say, yeah, I'm going to go and do it myself. So he decides, right, I'm going back up the mountain on my own, and I'm going to kill the Overlord, and you'll all be proved wrong. I am worthy, because that's the one thing he has to do. He has to prove to himself that he is worthy, because he's had this abusive childhood where he's been told he's not worthy. He's not worthy. He's never going to be good enough, which the Overlord thought was the way of driving him to perfection, to become his ideal heir who could take over from him. But actually, it just turned him to a very bitter and resentful man, Primarch. So he does this. He climbs up the mountain, he gets to the Overlord's palace, and he faces the Overlord in single combat. But of course, he does fail. He cannot cope with the toxic fog. Even him, as a Primarch, probably the most durable of all Primarchs, cannot cope with it, because it's just too intense, too thick. And this makes me strongly believe that the Overlord is definitely an alien and not a mutant, because there are many mutant strains of humans, of abhumans and so on. None of them are superior to a Primarch in its ability to cope with a toxin like this, a toxic fog, particularly Mortarion. So the fact that the Overlord can function perfectly normally in this environment, and as the other Overlords can, makes you think that he has to be a Xeno. He can't be just another mutant. Also, the description, his physical description, when the Emperor fights him, sounds very insectoid. He's kind of like a big, gangly, half man, half spider-shaped creature. They're very long limbs, more almost like an exoskeleton. He doesn't seem to be wearing an armored suit that makes him like this. He just seems to, his physical description is of a very alien-sounding creature. So the Emperor steps in, kills the High Overlord, because Mortarion collapses on the floor, just can't cope with the toxic gas. And the last thing he sees before he passes out is basically the Emperor taking his opportunity to gain his revenge and prove his worthiness to the Overlord, the High Overlord. So he creates in him a deep, deep resentment of the Emperor, that forever he will have this hatred, and he even says it to himself. From this moment, I will hate you forever, or something like he says. So in his own mind. So he hates the Emperor. For the entire time he's serving the Emperor, up to the heresy, he has this deep, deep hatred of the Emperor. He also hears the voice of Nurgle trying to speak to him at this same time. Now, he doesn't really, because he's basically dying at this point, going unconscious, he doesn't really remember that for most of his life. But it's there, and Nurgle is trying to turn him at this point. He's trying to get him to say, if you embrace me now, I can teach you how to overcome death, because I think is the general idea is the only way to overcome death is to be death. So he taught to embrace it. So he has to embrace the living death of one of the servants of Nurgle. But because the Emperor intercedes and cuts down the Overlord and takes Mortarion down the mountain to get treatment, he doesn't need to turn to Nurgle, and he comes back round and finds that everything's fine. And he's now got to swear loyalty to the Emperor, because that was his bargain he made. But this will come back to him later in life, this memory of Nurgle speaking to him at this point, when he does eventually turn to Nurgle. This is the moment where the Primarch that we come to know and love as Mortarion is made, because in this act of rescue by the Emperor, he sees it as an act of betrayal, essentially, that he's taken away from him, he's stolen from him that opportunity to be worthy, to be the man he thought he could be, and defeating the Overlord himself. And he's also taken away the leadership of the planet, because now he's in charge of the planet, but he's actually had to swear fealty to another overlord, the Emperor now. So he's replaced the High Overlord with the Emperor as an overlord. He's still not the top. He's still not truly worthy, because he's just serving another master. And that deep resentment for the Emperor leads him to eventually turn on the Emperor when the opportunity comes. Of course, when Horus leads the rebellion against the Emperor, Mortarion is very quickly on his side. In fact, he's on his side really before Horus reveals that he's going to betray the Emperor, because he's served closely with Horus. The legions have worked together a lot. They work together well. And like many of the Primarchs, they look up to Horus. They feel like he gets them, and that he uses them in the way that they should be used, and wants them to do well, etc., which they don't always feel about the Emperor, who's a bit more of a distant figure. And so it's a very natural step for him to just embrace Horus as his new overlord. And he kind of accepts that's his role. Now, he will come to resent Horus as well in time, as that's just his nature. And Horus does let him down and does mistreat him, but that's what Horus does as well during the heresy to pretty much everyone. But at that first stage of the heresy, it all makes perfect sense to Mortarion that he should just switch his allegiance from the Emperor, who he's always hated, over to Horus. And that's really it. That is the story of Mortarion. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about Typhon? Do you think he actually was half alien? Are the overlords aliens or mutants? It's very hard to tell. Do you have any sympathy at all for Mortarion and what he became, and the way he felt about the Emperor? I mean, he's not unique in resenting the Emperor, but he does seem to have the deepest hatred for the Emperor out of all the Primarchs, maybe other than Kurz. Well, actually, that's not true. Angron, of course. Angron hates the Emperor probably as deeply as anyone can. But Mortarion is right up there in his absolute disdain for the Emperor. Do you think that was justified in any way? If the heresy hadn't happened, how long do you think Mortarion could have stayed within the Imperium, serving the Emperor that he hated so much, seeing sorcery and psychic abilities being used across the Imperium, the thing that he despised so much? Would he eventually have led his own heresy? So let me know what you think. Great to see your comments as always. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe, like the video, it really helps, and I will see you next time.